Hello, everybody. I welcome you to today's lecture. We are in the third week of the semester. Today, our topic is incomplete decolonization in Africa. When we talk about the term or the concept decolonization, it has actually featured very prominently, particularly in South Africa, beginning or somewhere in the year 2014. When we talk about decolonization, it encompasses a lot of ideas. Nonetheless, most of the times when we talk about decolonization in scholarship, it seems to draw attention to the fact that when it comes to knowledge production and thinking in Africa, it is usually defined and dominated by the by the Western worldview. This means that when it comes to knowledge production and thinking in Africa, the theories that are used are usually Western inclined. The modes or the methods of data collection are all methods that are propounded by Western scholars from the Western perspective. And the fact that knowledge production and thinking in Africa is dominated by Western view is an indication that really Africa is not decolonized as it appears to be. What this means is that for the past 60 years, African countries have gained their independence from their colonial masters. But the big question is, are African countries, the African people, and the African continent as a whole, is it really decolonized? Are they really free from their colonial masters or from the influence of their colonial masters? There are various ways one can choose to demonstrate how the decolonization agenda in Africa has not achieved its needed results. This doesn't mean that some attempts have not been made to decolonize Africa completely. Some attempts have been made. Nonetheless, the attempts have not been radical enough to achieve the necessary results that it is intended to achieve. Some scholars are of the view that the decolonization project or agenda has not been achieved completely up to date because the traditional view of decolonization was associated with the idea of nationalism, where decolonization was equated to political liberation. What this means is that at the beginning of the idea of decolonization, the African thought that once the African people or the African continent is liberated from their colonial masters, it meant that the African continent and the African people are decolonized. But studies over the years have indicated that the fact that Africa as a continent has gained its political independence from their colonial masters doesn't mean that the continent is truly decolonized. So let's look at what decolonization means. The concept of decolonization is becoming very popular within the academic circles. And this popularity became even more profound when the media and several scholars began to show interest in the discourse on decolonization. Before the media and a lot of scholars began to show interest in decolonization, when we talked about the term decolonization, it was largely used by some few scholars in the global south. These are largely scholars in Latin America and then the Asian Subaltern Study Group of scholars. In South Africa, the idea or the concept of decolonization became so popular that it was lifted away from academic discourse or discussion into the national consciousness. And this influenced the establishment of student movements to achieve certain goals. Examples of these students' movements includes Rhodes Must Fall, and then later there was another student established movement which was known as Feast Must Fall. With these two students' movements, the purpose was to call for the decolonization of the higher education curriculum in South Africa. If you look at the movement known as Rhodes Must Fall, it was established on the 9th of March 2015. And the original purpose of this establishment was towards the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes that was mounted at the University of Cape Town to commemorate him. Cecil Rhodes happens to be a British imperialist who was very strong in the British colonial regime. He was someone who believed in the superiority of the British people above all other people and did not value the African. So this students' movement was of the view that someone who had championed the cause of colonialism cannot have his statue at the center of one of South Africa's big universities. And the fact that the statue was still in the university meant that the university had not gained its freedom from their colonial masters. So this movement called for the removal of the statue of Cecil Rhodes from the university. The campaign of this movement spread across South Africa, and then it gained a wider momentum such that it moved away from just a call for the removal of the statue to a call to decolonize the entire educational system in South Africa. For many scholars, when you talk about decolonization, two important questions arise. And these questions are, what does decolonization mean? And the second is, what does it take in practical terms? So we are going to look at the meaning of decolonization. When we talk about decolonization, the term means different things to different people. So depending on what meaning it adopts, it also evokes a lot of sentiments among people. According to Fanon, 1963, decolonization is just not a critique, but a process and program of decentering colonial rationality, structures, institutions, knowledge systems, and worldview. Redu also shares the view that decolonization simply is a call for the colonized to know themselves, as in the Muslim African know thyself. When it is applied in the African context, it equally has a lot of understanding or meanings. According to Thomas Sankara, he is of the view that decolonization is a revolutionary movement that sets the restoration of the dignity of African people as its goal. Nyamjo also sees decolonization as a process of unveiling the hegemonic nature of the epistemological paradigm to the conqueror. And lastly, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, 1986, he is also of the view that decolonization in the African context essentially entails a process of overcoming the alienation of an African from his or herself caused by the colonial devaluation of African culture, life, art, religion, geography, and most importantly, languages. So, in summary, when we talk about decolonization in Africa, it basically means a return of the African to his original state. It also means the recognition of all the changes that the African has gone through, and then a return to the original cultural background of the African people. It means returning back to the culture of the African people, the life, the arts, the religion, and most importantly, returning to the language that the African people spoke before the coming of Europeans into Africa. There are several ways, or there are several aspects of the African economy that can be used to demonstrate how the decolonization agenda in Africa has not been completed. But in this lecture, we are going to look at two of them. We will first look at land, and then we will also look at economy. So let's begin with economy. In terms of economy, let's look at the structure of African economy. Upon the coming of Europeans to Africa, they realized that the African continent was a continent that was richly endowed in natural resources. Some of these natural resources included gold, timber, diamond, cocoa, and you can add to the list. The land of Africa was so rich that anything that was grown on the land produced a lot of end products or a lot of fruits. For that reason, the Europeans structured the African economy in such a way that it became producers of raw materials and not finished products. Sadly, 50 years after African countries had gained their independence from their colonial masters, the African economy continues to be producers of raw materials that is used to feed the industries of the European masters. When you look at countries like Angola and Chad, and Congo, Brazzaville, and Nigeria, you realize that about one commodity accounts for more than 75% of their total exports. And apart from these countries, you also realize that most African countries only deal in the exportation of raw materials. If you look at the value chain of production, from raw materials to the actual production to finished goods, before it comes to the market to be sold, you realize that the chain of raw materials has very little value as compared to when it has been turned into finished products. Because of that, Africans only receive very little amount of wealth or value on the raw materials that they present or they export to the European countries, where the European countries receive more value on the end products that they produce. These end products are shipped back to Africa to be consumed by a few people, especially the elite population in Africa. So apart from Africa becoming the producers of raw materials to feed the European industries, it also became consumers of these finished products, thereby be serving as a market source where the finished products of these European countries can be sold and consumed. If you look at a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is a country that produces copper. And most of the times, this copper is shipped to the European countries and then converted into jewelries. Hutonji 1997 makes a very interesting comparison between the production of commodity and the production of knowledge in Africa. According to him, if you look at how knowledge is produced in Africa, it is just as how commodity is also produced in Africa. For him, the Europeans come to Africa to collect raw data. When the raw data is collected through research, they go back to their European countries, analyze the data, and then use it to produce articles and books. These books are then sent back to Africa for the African people to use as a source of knowledge to teach their people, to teach in schools. Apart from that, theories are propounded from the data that they gather from Africa. And then these theories are supposed to be used by the African people in their research. So what he's trying to say is that just as raw materials are picked from Africa and then processed into finished goods to be consumed by the African people, raw data is also picked from Africa and then analyzed and converted into knowledge, which is also brought back to the African people for them to be used within the academic circles. The next aspect of the African economy that also shows that Africa is not truly decolonized is what Moyo refers to as enclavity. According to Moyo, when we talk about enclavity, is a concept that captures the colonial logic where economic activities in Africa were set up without any regard for the colonial population. And here, the driving force for the establishment of these activities was largely geared towards the interest of the colonial masters. So what Moyo is simply saying is that Another aspect of the African economy that demonstrates that Africa is not truly free from their colonial masters is the fact that when activities are being embarked upon or when infrastructures are being set up, it does not take into consideration the interest of the people who live in that area where that activity is going to be held. Rather, it is motivated by the interest of whoever is in power. So, for instance, during the colonial era, there were the construction of roads, there were the construction of railways from the interiors of Africa to the towns. But note, the purpose for the construction of these roads and railways was not to help the people in their transportation system, was not to help convey the people from the interiors to the town, but rather it was to help the colonial masters carry products, goods like timber, like cocoa, from the farms into the towns or into the harbors and shipped or exported out of the continent of Africa. Sadly, this idea of enclavity continues to hold in African countries today. So you go to the mining sectors in Ghana, for instance, and you expect that since Obuasi is a mining area, it should be a place where development is on the higher side. But you go to these places and you realize that it is one of the poorest sectors or one of the poorest areas in Ghana, although it is one of the areas that provides Ghana with a high amount of gold that is exported out of the country, which brings foreign income to the Ghanaian economy as a whole. Again, when you go into the mining sectors, for instance, you realize that about 90% of the people who work in these mining areas are non-natives. This means that although the mining sector is located in Obuasi, you realize that the people who work in these sectors are not the indigenes of Obuasi, but rather people from different aspects of the country or even from outside Ghana. So what this means is that there are establishment of infrastructures, establishment of industries, there are the construction of roads. Nonetheless, the purpose for these establishments do not take into consideration the interest of the people who live in this area. That is why in recent years, you realize that people embark on protests and demonstrations against some government establishments and policies that are being brought into their communities, which they think will not be in their interest. The next aspect of the economy, which we are going to talk about or we are going to use to demonstrate that indeed the African continent is not truly free from their colonial masters, has to do with the use of economic growth models. When you come to Africa, the economic models or the things that are used to measure the growth of the economy are models that are from the Western countries, but not models that are developed in Africa. Most of the times, these economic growth models are developed to solve particular challenges in the advanced countries where they were developed. So when they are transferred to be used in Africa, it poses a lot of challenges. It is unable to provide solutions that the African economies need. This is because these models do not take into consideration the changes in environments, the setup of the African economy. You understand? Sadly, in today's world, the great African economists and the great African leaders have not been able to change these models and develop new models that are tailored towards the economy of the African people. Because of that, there is a lot of challenges or problems in the African economy that remains and has not been solved. So the continuous use of foreign growth models as a measurement of the economy of Africa is indicative of the idea that the African economy or Africa as a continent is not truly decolonized. Sometimes there have been some efforts to invent models, economic models that are suitable for the African economies. But the European or the colonial masters still hold the idea that when it comes to knowledge production, what is relevant and what is important or what can be accepted is knowledge that is produced by the Western people. Apart from the Western world, any other form of knowledge that is produced is not truly knowledge. And so, according to Magnolo 2009, he is of the view that the Western world sees any other form of knowledge as just the production of wisdom and culture, but not truly knowledge. The next one we are going to look at is land. We are going to look at how the use of land or how the land system in Africa today is indicative of the fact that Africa is not truly decolonized as it is supposed to be. Okay, to begin with, we are going to look at the structure of the African land tenure system. With the coming of Europeans to Africa, they first introduced a foreign land tenure system. And this foreign land tenure system that was introduced was one that was based on the European concept of land and property in general. If you read a lot about write-ups or scholarly articles on the land tenure system in Africa, you realize that a lot of the scholars agree to the fact that there has been an introduction of foreign land tenure system in Africa. This introduction of the land tenure system completely changed the way the Africans looked at their concept of land, or it completely influenced how the African perceived land. And the result is that it led to what is referred to as dualism in the tenure system of Africa. Before the coming of Europeans, the land tenure system was such that the chiefs were seen as the owners of the land. Apart from the chiefs, the clan heads were also owners of the land. So the land did not belong to one particular person. It belonged to the entire community. And the chiefs, as well as the family heads, had control, or let's say oversight responsibility over the land. But with the coming of the Europeans, this idea was changed. So they introduced a new system which brought into existence two ideas about the land. So after the coming of the Europeans, land did not only belong to the communities or the chiefs and the family heads, it also belonged to the state, which means that with the coming of the Europeans, there was a concept that the state had control over the land in the country, whilst the chiefs also had control over land within their community. And what this led to was a clash of ownership. So it led to a lot of tension and a lot of conflict between the state and the chiefs. And the reason why the Europeans introduced this foreign land tenure system was that they looked at the traditional land tenure system as one that was a barrier or a hindrance to investment and economic growth. They saw the traditional land tenure system as one that was inferior, inefficient, and unproductive. This is because the chiefs were in charge of the land in their communities. Any development or any project that the colonial masters wanted to embark on. They had to seek permission from the chiefs to release the lands to them before they could embark on some of these projects. And in situations where the chiefs refused to release specific lands to the colonial masters at certain specific places, it became a barrier to the establishment of whatever projects they wanted to embark on. For this reason, they saw the traditional land tenure system as a hindrance to development. But in cases where the land was owned by the states, it meant that the states decided whatever they wanted to do with whichever land at any time without needing to consult or seek permission from any chief or family head. Another area of distortion of the concept of land has to do with the actual concept of land. Here, the Europeans were of the view that land is just like any other property that can be owned by anybody, and that person has absolute right of ownership over that particular land. But when it came to the African setup, like I've already mentioned, land was not seen as a property that can be owned by an individual, but land was something that could be shared collectively. Everybody had access to the land. So in traditional system, if one family had a land, every member of that family was entitled to the usage of that land. So a portion of the land can be given to you to grow your crops and to farm. You can lay claim of the crops you have grown on that land as your crops, but you cannot lay claim on the land that you have grown the crops on. So in the African setup, there was a clear distinction between the soil and the things that were grown on it. So there was a clear distinction between the land and the things that can be found on the land. Because the land, as I've already indicated, belonged to the community, belonged and was overseen by the chiefs as well as the family heads. Every member of the community could be given a piece of the land to farm on. You can say, this plantain belongs to me because you planted it. You can say, this cassava is mine because you grew it. But you could not say that the land you have grown your crops on belongs to you, because the land belonged to the entire community and the family as a whole. On the contrary, when you come to the European concept, land was owned by individuals, such that whoever owned the land also owned the things that were found on the land. Sadly, in today's Africa, you realize that the European concept of the land tenure system is what is still being used or what is still being practiced today in our countries. So in today's Africa, land is bought by individuals. Individuals have total control over the land. They hire land guards to protect the land. There are documentations on the land that shows ownership. In today's Africa, the chiefs do not have much control over the lands that where they reside. And so the government can decide and say that I'm going to build a hospital here, and the chiefs do not have a say, because the ownership now belongs to the state, which is also overseen by the president. The issue of the distortion of land, or the issue of the concept of land, which has been changed into the European concept, has brought about some distortions. And we are going to mention three of these distortions. In today's Africa, there is the idea that land should have an owner. And this is a distortion from the traditional view, because traditionally, land was not owned by individuals. It was not a property that could be owned. It was rather shared collectively by the community. Also, there is the idea that only members of a given tribe should own land in a particular community. And this also goes contrary to the traditional view or concepts about land. And thirdly, that a person should be responsible for the administration of land. And this person who is responsible for the administration of land is effectively the landowner. What this means is that once you acquire a land, you have the right to do whatever you wish to do with that land, and nobody can prevent you from doing whatever you want to do with it. That is why in recent years, people buy lands anywhere that they can afford, and they decide to put up any project or structure, even if the activity they are going to embark on will be harmful to the people who live in that particular area. Akufu concludes that the distorted view on the conceptualization of land from what we have discussed so far is as a result of transporting the conceptualization of land in the European context to the African context, which creates not only confusion, but also tension and conflict as well. So in summary, today we have looked at the decolonization agenda in Africa, and we use land in the economy to demonstrate how Africa is still not completely decolonized as it should be. We have indicated that because Africans are still raw producers of materials that are sent to the European countries and turned into finished goods, Africa is still not completely free from their colonial masters. What this means is that until African countries move away from the production of raw materials into the production of finished goods, it is still not fully decolonized. Again, until African economies are able to develop models in African continent to solve the African problem, the idea of decolonization will still not be complete. Again, until Africans are able to change the land tenure system from the dual tenure of land being owned by individuals and being controlled by chiefs, the decolonization agenda will still not be complete in Africa. So, after 60 years of gaining independence, the African continent can be said not to be truly free from their colonial masters. Thank you very much, and see you again in the next lecture.